Welcome to Deconstruct, a podcast from The Real Deal. I'm Lilah Burke.
And I'm Hannah Kramer. And today we'll take you through some of the most important headlines in New York real estate news before chatting with our colleague, Deconstruct, about a sort of particular development that's happening in an Upper East Side rental building.
Let's dive in.
To start today, we want to talk about the ever-important New York City budget. Tell us about that, Lilah.
Yes. So on Tuesday, Mayor Zoran Mamdani announced his executive budget. And the big thing here is that he has touted that he has closed the budget gap without any cut in services and for real estate without a property tax. Now, however, the pied-à-terre tax that we've been talking about for a few weeks on here is assumed to be part of the budget revenue.
Yeah, one of the things that I think was interesting about this is the way that people are adjusting to kind of the narrative around the pied-à-terre tax. The property tax hike was always unpopular, and not just with real estate. That was going to be unpopular with voters, too.
After he announced it, it kind of seemed like something that was never really going to happen.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting contrast to the pied-à-terre tax, which on the other hand, you know, the way that brokers are talking about it has really shifted. A couple weeks ago, it seemed like people were really trying to rally to fight. We talked last week about Bess Friedman and Pam Liebman being united on the anti-pied-à-terre tax front at our forum. But now people are kind of just saying, you know, we don't like it, but it's like any other additional tax. And second home investors who are buying these places in New York, they're going to price it in. They may not love it. Maybe they'll sell in the long run, but it doesn't seem like there's been this rush to, you know, sell off $5 million plus residential assets here in the city either. Looking at the specifics of the budget, I want to just throw out there some of the numbers that affect real estate and the kind of most important departments for it, right? So one thing we have is $4 billion that will go towards the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD. Obviously, that is super important for any of those owners of rent stabilized, in particular, folks who have, you know, renters on vouchers in their buildings. Plus, there's another $500 million for HPD in fiscal year 2031, so 4 years down the road, which is aimed specifically at apartment construction. $500 million will build a couple of new apartments. It's not maybe the extent of the investment they need.
Yes, also worth noting is the mayor is touting savings to the CityFHEPS program, which is a voucher program for people who are homeless or soon to be homeless, who rent private units with private landlords. The city pays their rent. It's a very, very expensive program, and its costs have tripled in the last couple of years. It's a little unclear what the savings are coming from. We don't have a ton of clarity from the administration on that right now, but they're saying that it will not lead to fewer people being placed into housing. So they're looking to cut back a little bit on broker fees, and it seems like the amount of rent that they are willing to pay to landlords, the rent reasonableness.
Yeah, I mean, what did they say? They said they were going to tighten management protocols. So that leaves me kind of wondering, you know, how does that actually work? This is a program already that, like, we get a lot of complaints about how sort of slow it is to work, how much bureaucracy and red tape there is. So I think it'll be kind of interesting to see if they're able to cut out some of that red tape and bureaucracy, and if that represents the cost savings, or does streamlining the program require more investment? Like, that's a little bit unclear.
Yes. The state also did an audit. The state controller did an audit a few months ago of CityFHEPS and found that of the cases that they audited, none of them were assessed for the reasonableness of the rent, which is something that the city is supposed to do. They found that they were overpaying in some instances. So it might be more like that, actually more red tape.
So what does that mean for landlords if there's going to be potentially more red tape on some of these CityFHEPS programs?
So we don't know totally how this will affect landlords, but I will be talking to City Hall about that soon.
And then other sort of big political point from the last week, we had the preliminary rent guidelines board vote, starting to get signals about the much feared, much touted rent freeze. You were in the room. tell us what was happening.
So the Rent Guidelines Board, which controls the rent in rent-stabilized apartments, voted preliminarily to approve a rent increase of 0% to 2% for one-year leases, 0% being a rent freeze. Tenant advocates had different reactions to this. They make up most of the people in the room at the Rent Guidelines Board. There were some groups that, were chanting they wanted a rent freeze, but also other groups that wanted a quote-unquote rent rollback. They want negative increases, and that was something that was before the board that they considered but voted down. So people are feeling pretty emboldened, and they told me that they are planning to show out to all of these public hearings to get their rent freeze. So if you're a landlord, you might also want to show out.
Yeah, that is one of the things that's so crazy to me. First of all, about these hearings, how incredibly packed they are with tenant advocates, not so much representation from the real estate industry. But also, when we say a negative increase, that's a decrease, right? That is decreasing the monthly or annual rents in these units. And that's kind of the point where we get to, folks are terrified. Multifamily rent-stabilized owners are terrified in the first place of not being able to increase rents to at least start to cover the increase in costs, in insurance, in property taxes, as they go up normally, not even considering a big picture property tax hike. I mean, a decrease seems insane.
I mean, the board, to be clear, did not vote for a decrease, but yes, that's what people want. I mean, they got their mayor and they're like, let's push further. So, I mean, we'll see where the board comes down. They don't need to vote within the 0 to 2% range. That's just what they sort of preliminarily show their support for, but the final vote is in June.
So rent freeze, very possibly coming down the pike. Something else, though, a sort of important real estate policy that we started to hear about again at our New York City forum, a week and a half ago, almost 2 weeks ago now, J51. J51 is a tax break that allows building owners to get a break on taxes, commensurate to how much money they're putting into renovations, improvements on their buildings, right? Right now, it's capped at 70%. Something I thought was really interesting coming out of the forum was folks like Dina Levy talking about, expanding and kind of improving J51, which, unlike the rent freeze, unlike the pied-à-terre tax, would be kind of a meaningful improvement, at least for like a select group of people in the industry, right? What they've said they want to do is increase the potential abatement to 100% of the cost, and also increase the average unit cost in buildings that can receive this from an average of $45K in assessed value to $60K. So widening the pool a little bit of who can use J51, which, it still is a select group of buildings, and it still is a tax abatement. It's not always a perfect incentive for everyone, but I mean, it could be meaningful for a couple people.
Yeah, we will definitely have to see how that turns out and what the Mamdani administration decides to do on it.
Yeah. So now going up to the national level, and I know we've been talking a lot today about taxes, but like we talked about with, the Japanese investors looking at multifamily housing here in New York last week, these tax incentives are kind of everything, right? I mean, they really move the needle. So let's talk a little bit about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Not my favorite name for an
OBA?
OBA. Yeah. Could be better. Regardless, it has this sort of sweetener in it, this depreciation clause that basically allows owner-operators of buildings, so like a restaurant that owns the building that they're in, or an office tenant that owns their own space, to start to write stuff down.
Yeah, and we had a story from South Florida reporter Lydia Dinkova about this very thing, that companies are becoming a lot more interested in owning their own office space.
When I read this, I thought it was really interesting because 2-ish years ago, we saw kind of a big sweep of, the really high luxury retailers buying their own spaces, right?
Louis Vuitton,
Kering, yes. All of these folks. Jeff Sutton, who's the sort of famed retail investor here in New York, made off incredibly well, I think, on these huge sales of his buildings to, the people who occupy them. And I thought it was interesting at the time, we heard a lot of people talking about is this going to be the big trend? The big companies will buy their own buildings and then they can have, the equity in the real estate and rather than, the liability of the lease.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be just the big guys. I mean, Lydia spoke to a restaurant back operations, company that's like sort of smaller, and they were also interested in buying their own office and working out of there.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to see this trend that we saw with these huge companies trickle down to these smaller ones. But one thing it does have me thinking about a little bit, and I mean, look, this is a small trend. It's not like every person who rents an office or runs a restaurant is going to go out and buy their real estate right now. But, there's a little bit of a cutting landlords out of the mix. You pay them out, but they don't own the real estate anymore. So they're not, continuing to collect your lease.
I mean, as we know from owning the TRD office, there's also drawbacks. When your fridge handle breaks, you have to fix it.
You do, as we know well here in the office that The Real Deal owns.
All right, well, let's talk to Jake a little bit about the Upper East Side.
Let's do it.
For our main story this week, we have residential reporter Jake Indersky, who will be telling us about a sort of quirky situation in a rental building on the Upper East Side. Jake, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us about 800 Fifth Avenue.
Yeah. It's kind of a classic Upper East Side building. Elliot Spitzer owned it since the 1980s or something like that. It's a rental building, but it's where this big accumulation of wealthy Upper East Side renters, and it's a lot of people who have been there for decades. And then it was recently bought by another big name, Mickey Naftali, for $800 million. And, it's kind of considered like the best development site left in New York City. And so people think that we might see the most expensive condos that we'll ever see in the city going up there at some point, whenever that happens. Still a long way away. But it's a fun building because it brings together this old Upper East Side renter, kind of like crusty, and a longtime developer trying to build these new luxury condos.
In order for Mickey Naftali to build these condos, though, all of the renters who are currently in the building have to leave. And that's kind of what your story focuses on, right?
Yeah. So we've reported on the building sale and sort of, the steps Naftali's taking. But it's also, because it has all these interesting dynamics at play, I got to do this interesting story about what's happening to the 208 wealthy renters who have been there, which is sort of like the world's smallest violin kind of thing. Because, you don't feel that bad for these people who are able to pay $8,000 to $10,000 a month. But it actually turns out it's been really challenging for them, or at least that's what they would say. And their brokers too.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how it's going for these renters.
So the big thing that I found is that it's really hard to rent in the Upper East Side. The Upper East Side in general has become a really competitive market for both buying and for renting. And I think actually from talking to brokers who have worked with some of the people that are trying to find a new place to live, multiple of them said their clients were like, well, I've been renting for decades. I want to keep renting. And then after looking at their options, I checked for the story. There were 20 rentals available on Street Easy in the neighborhood. They were like, I think I actually have to buy. And even then, going into the Upper East Side co-op world, one of the brokers had their clients get rejected from a co-op. They're not having an easy time. It's hard out there.
Okay, and when you talk about the neighborhood, 20 rentals, I mean, there's more rentals east of Lexington Avenue, right? But that's not the Upper East Side that we're talking about here.
No, it's sort of this self-imposed restriction that's happening. One broker who found her client a co-op to buy after struggling with the rental market, but she said I couldn't pay her to move east of Park Avenue. That's the type of person that we're dealing with. And so, it's kind of a quirky story, but it also speaks to the Upper East Side as this really hot market in the city.
So with that said, what are their options? What are they doing?
Yeah, good question. So it's been a few. One is buy a co-op, which, you can still find in some of the older co-op buildings a little bit more affordable. That'll be in the $2 to $3 million range. The other, I talked to a broker who actually set their client up in the Fasano, which is this sort of members club, but they also offer this almost hotel service where you can do these 30-day rentals, or her client is planning to stay there for a long time, but that costs $175,000 a month. That's the options that we're talking about. And then actually, I didn't include this in the story, But I went over to the building and talked to two tenants, both of whom gave me big eye rolls and were like, we don't know what to do. And they were both talking about looking at hotels. And then, of course, they were like, the Pierre, the Share Netherland. So it's kind of, people are just going where they can. And there's not a lot of places to go. Maybe some of them are moving east of Park Avenue. I don't know.
And this is a big opportunity for the brokers that they're working with, right?
Yeah, that's how the story came to be. I talked to Lisa Simonson. She actually used to live in the building. And so she has a relationship with some of the people there. And so for her, it's been, a windfall because she has all these people that have to move, within the year. And so she set up one of her clients in the Pisano. I think a couple of other of her clients have bought co-ops. And I talked to another broker who helped her client, the one who wouldn't move east of Park Avenue, buy a co-op. And she said she's sent mailers to the entire building because it's like, we don't know exactly how many people still have to move, but some of the residents estimated like 50% have left. So you have like 100 people who are relatively wealthy who have to either rent or buy something. And so, yeah, if you're a broker, I don't know why I wouldn't be knocking on the doors of 800 Fifth every day.
And remind us a little bit about how this problem started. I mean, they're being forced out, right?
Yeah. So Naftali bought the building and everyone still had a lease at the time. What you see happen a lot in New York is a developer buys a building or wants to buy a building and like there's 3 rent stabilized tenants and they don't move and they need to pay them millions of dollars. That's kind of a classic New York story. That has not been the scenario here. And there's also good cause eviction laws, which make even removing market rate tenants slightly more difficult. Good cause eviction doesn't apply in this case because you're dealing with luxury renters. And so I talked to the former leasing agent who said the leasing office shut down last year. And I didn't get a clear answer from, a spokesperson for Naftali, but from talking to agents and tenants, it seems like everyone will be out by the end of the year.
I wanted to sort of get a little bit of your sense of what the really competitive market on the Upper East Side says about the rental versus apartment purchase market in the city. It appears to me that if even in this market, which is, the people who have the most flexibility, the most optionality because they are wealthy, at least on some level, even these people can't find a rental. And if they are finding a rental, it's a space that's much smaller than what they had at 800 Fifth. And if they're finding a co-op, maybe the co-op is smaller than what they had in their previous building. So what does that kind of say to you about like the big picture of both the upper end of the market and the residential market generally across the city?
I think it's no surprise that the rental market is really difficult in New York across the price spectrum. It's obviously like a kind of funny story, but I think that's why I was also interested in it because it speaks to, I think, the challenge of finding a place to live in New York City. With the rental market in particular, I was surprised when I had agents saying that they had to advise their clients that they should be buying instead of renting. And the Upper East Side, it's always been a desirable location, but it's become even more so. And so you have people who have lived there for decades and, have relatively cheaper rents than looking at the market and saying, like, I can't afford anything. It's like, anybody that I might know living in Crown Heights and they've been in their apartment for 5 years and they go and try and find a new apartment and they're like, I can't afford anything. It's basically the same story playing out, but just on a different sort of price scale.
I will say on a personal anecdote, I just had this happen to me, right? I've lived in my apartment for 6 years. My husband and I went to go look at new apartments, and it ultimately has been cheaper for us to buy an apartment, which we are now doing in the same neighborhood, but rather than moving to something new, because even just in the last, half decade, all of the prices around us have gone up so much, and that's in, pretty deep Brooklyn, that the option to buy, maybe the sales market actually becomes better than the rental.
Yeah, deep Brooklyn, Upper East Side, more similarities than you would think.
Totally the same vibes and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, Jake, thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Okay, Lilah, let's talk about your favorite real estate story of the week.
All right, so this is a story that I've been a little obsessed with this week. It's kind of a nightmare for a CEO at a big lender that we cover. It's such a nightmare that I actually feel bad even talking about it in some ways. But Fortress Investment Group, which The Fortress credit arm we cover as a lender is coming for Charles Cohen on personal guarantees. That's sort of the background.
And so you talk to these guys normally about pretty staid financial topics, right?
Yeah. Where is this loan going? What's your legal strategy? Things like that. This is sort of a different topic where CEO Wes Edens, it seems like, has been perhaps sextorted. Sexually extorted.
Okay. So how does that happen?
So everything I'm about to say was alleged in a federal indictment and was originally reported by the Wall Street Journal. But here's the situation. It's 2022. Wes Edens, 60 years old, billionaire, owner of the Milwaukee Bucks. He's divorced and he's on LinkedIn.
Where all great romances start.
Or sextortion plots. Yeah. So he gets a message from a woman named Sophia Luo. And she's not just, a random woman. She seems like a professional. She's a nonprofit founder. She is an entrepreneur, and she was born in China. Okay, they get to talking. One thing leads to another. In the summer of 2023, they have sex. This is relevant because he is being extorted. I'm not just talking about his sex life. Okay, after that, Luo writes Edens a love letter. He does not respond.
Harsh.
Then, after a couple of months, things become threatening. She starts threatening to go to investors. She starts threatening to release video of their encounter. She is saying she was mentally incapacitated at the time that they had sex. Edens denies this. And she starts going to the doctor's office where his then girlfriend, now wife, was working, talking to her. So it gets a little extreme. Edens wants this to stop.
Sure.
Obviously. So he goes to mediation with Luo, and they agree to settle the issue for $6.5 million. Then Sophia Luo finds out that she has HPV, and there's different strains of HPV. This is one of the ones that can give you cervical cancer in the future. So she wants to renegotiate and starts becoming more aggressive about the dispute, and at one point asks for $1.2 billion with a B.
Jeez.
So a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if she thought she could get $1 billion or, what the situation was there.
She's really moving the kind of target amount that she's willing to settle for there from, $6.5 million to $1.2 billion. I mean, that's an insane jump.
Yes, it's a big jump. Edens seems to also think so. Someone on his team goes to federal law enforcement, and Luo was indicted for extortion last year. The Wall Street Journal uncovered a little bit more about this. Her house was raided by the FBI. They found 2 hidden phones, photos of Edens' face photoshopped onto other men's bodies. It's kind of a crazy situation. Edens obviously denies any, allegations of misconduct. Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see where this case goes.
This is just such a crazy case, such a weird sort of second view on, the founders of this company that we cover all the time as these very aggressive at times lenders, but, straight business people. And then you have this crazy sextortion story that's going on for the CEO, in the background over the last several years as we've continued to cover them.
Yeah. And one thing I'll say, this makes me think, pretty hard to date as a billionaire. When you have money, people want it, whether in romance or in work. Lenders, money makes you a target. So that's something to think about as you all are trying to become rich out there.
Be careful what you wish for. All right. That's all we have for you this week, folks. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back with another episode of Deconstruct next week.
Thanks for listening.